My name is Nora Calloway, and I was 36 years old the Thanksgiving my sister stood up from the dinner table, pressed both hands to her stomach, and announced to 14 people that my husband was the father of her baby. The room went so quiet, I could hear the candles hissing. She was looking right at me when she said it, not at him, at me. The way you look at someone when the point of what you're doing isn't information, it's damage. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my husband had been waiting for exactly this moment for 11 months. Not to fight, not to rage, to say one sentence, quietly, in front of everyone. And that sentence didn't just end her story. It ended the version of my life that had been built around a lie I hadn't known I was living. Welcome back to her silent triumph. Stories about the women who held their breath, kept their receipts, and let the truth do the loudest work. If you've ever sat at a table where someone tried to use a room full of people as a weapon against you, you're exactly where you need to be tonight. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me tell you who I was before that Thanksgiving, because the woman at that table was not a woman who broke easily, and that matters for everything that comes after. I am a forensic accountant, have been for 11 years. I spend my professional life inside the gap between what people say happened to their money and what the numbers actually show. I am patient. I am methodical. I am the person companies call when they already suspect someone and need someone who won't blink at a spreadsheet that runs 500 pages long. I build cases the way other people build houses. One verified fact at a time, load-bearing, no shortcuts. I mention this because people who heard what happened that night kept saying how calm I was, how still. They said it like it was something strange, something almost cold. It wasn't cold. It was just the only thing I knew how to be when the ground drops out. You don't panic. You gather data. You wait for the full picture before you move. My husband's name is Daniel. We met when I was 28, at a conference neither of us wanted to attend, eating bad hotel shrimp at a networking reception where we both gravitated to the corner like two people who'd rather be reading. He is a civil engineer. He designs load-bearing structures for a living, which I always thought was its own kind of love language. A man who thinks about what holds things up. We married 4 years after that shrimp reception. Small wedding. A backyard in October, string lights, his college roommate playing acoustic guitar slightly out of tune. I wore my grandmother's earrings. We wrote our own vows, which Daniel delivered without once looking at a card, which I have never quite gotten over. We bought a house on Carver Street. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that needed updating, a back porch that got afternoon light. We got a dog named Fig, a brindle mutt of no identifiable breed who believed firmly that the couch was his. We built a life that was ordinary in every way that ordinary is actually extraordinary when you're inside it. My sister's name is Leanne. She is 3 years younger than me and has occupied the bright center of every room she has ever walked into, not because she is cruel, but because she is magnetic in a way that I was not, and she learned very young how to use it. Growing up, Leanne got the better grades with half the effort. She got the attention at parties. She got the boys, almost universally, even the ones who had started out interested in me. I do not say this with bitterness. I have done enough therapy to know the difference between a wound and a fact. It is simply what was true. Leanne moved through the world at a frequency that drew people, and I moved through it at a quieter register, and for most of our lives, we had found a way to coexist peacefully inside that asymmetry. I thought we were close. I thought we had built something between us, adult sisters, past the competitions of childhood, into something more honest. I had been wrong about a lot of things that year, but I was wrong about that one first and longest. The first odd thing happened in January, 11 months before Thanksgiving. I noticed it the way I notice things at work. As a number that doesn't quite add up, an entry that should reconcile but doesn't, a feeling that sits in the back of my mind like a persistent low-grade hum. Daniel started coming home quieter. Not unhappy, not cold, just quieter than his baseline, which was already a man who chose his words carefully. But there were evenings when he'd come in from the garage after an hour and sit at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, and I'd look at him from across the room and see something behind his eyes that I didn't have a name for yet. I asked him once, around February, He looked up from the table and said, "I'm working through something. I'll tell you when I understand it better." That was a Daniel answer. He didn't speak unfinished thoughts. So I waited, the way you wait when you trust someone, the way you wait when the trust is so embedded in the structure of your life that questioning it feels like questioning the foundation of the house itself. I went back to my spreadsheets. I told myself it was work stress. He was in the middle of a complicated bridge retrofit project. There were permit delays, budget overruns. I told myself all the sensible things. I was not wrong to trust him. I want to be clear about that now, even though clarity came slowly and badly. But I was wrong to not ask harder questions when the quiet in our house changed pitch sometime around March. Because by March, I had noticed something else. Leanne was calling less. This sounds small. It wasn't. Leanne and I talked twice a week, usually on Tuesdays and Sundays. We had done this since I moved away for college, and we'd never really stopped. The calls were ordinary, rambling about nothing, her dadding life, my work cases, Fig's opinions about squirrels. They were the background hum of our sisterhood. In March, they became once a week. In April, once every 10 days. She started letting calls go to voicemail and returning them as texts. Short ones. Totally fine, just crazy busy lately. Talk soon. The kind of texts people send when they're managing a distance they don't want to explain. I noticed. I filed it. I didn't yet know where to put it. Our mother noticed too. She mentioned it at Easter dinner, a small gathering at my parents' house, the 4 of us and my father's brother who came every year with wine he'd already half consumed. "Leanne," she said, "you've been so hard to reach." Leanne smiled the smile she kept for deflection and said she was in a big project at work, that things were hectic, that she'd be back to normal soon. Daniel was quiet through that dinner in a way that had a shape to it, a specific shape I couldn't quite trace. He passed the bread. He answered questions. He helped my father carry in the ham. But there was a precision to how he moved through that meal that I didn't have a word for until much later. I would understand eventually that he was being careful. He was being careful around my family, the way a man is careful when he's protecting something and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. I will tell you now what I didn't know then, not because the timeline excuses anything, but because the full truth is the only version worth telling. Leanne had kissed my husband at a party in November, 11 months before Thanksgiving. My work holiday party, where she had come as my +1 because her boyfriend at the time had just ended things and she hadn't wanted to stay home. Too much wine. A hallway near the coat check. A moment that Daniel had stopped after a few seconds, stepped back and said clearly, "This is not happening." He told me, not that night, but 2 weeks later, on a Sunday, sitting at the kitchen table, hands flat on the surface the way he sits when he's about to say something he has been carrying too long. He told me all of it. The exactness of what happened. The fact that he had stopped it. The fact that he'd been trying to work out how to say it in a way that didn't break something between us. I sat with it for a long time. We both did in that kitchen with Fig asleep across Daniel's feet, the lights too bright. I believed him, not because I was naive, because I knew him, and because the accounting of his account was consistent. The timeline, the way he described it, the fact that he'd been sitting with it since November, and the only thing that had changed in him since November was that he came home quieter. Guilt moves through an honest man in a specific way. I recognized it. I was angry. I would be lying if I told you otherwise. Not just at Leanne, though at Leanne certainly, but at the situation. At the particular cruelty of a thing that happens in a hallway at a party, and then radiates out into the structure of everything you've built. Not because the thing itself was catastrophic, but because it became a test of what everyone was made of. Leanne and I talked on the phone. It was not a good conversation. She cried. She said she'd been in a terrible place emotionally after the breakup, that it wasn't what she intended, that she hated herself for it. I listened. I said I needed time. I said I didn't know what time looked like yet. She said she understood. She said she would wait. The calls had gotten fewer after that. I had thought I was the one who needed distance. I had thought Leanne's quiet was the quiet of a woman ashamed, waiting for her sister to find her way back to her. I had been wrong about that too. Here is the part I want you to stay with, Because it's the part that people often skip over in these stories to get to the dramatic moment. The slow part. The quiet part. The 8 months between the conversation and Thanksgiving. Because in those 8 months, I was doing something I didn't have a name for until later. I was watching. Not obsessively. Not with a list. Just the way a forensic accountant watches numbers when something doesn't quite add up. You don't go looking for fraud. You just stop pretending the anomaly isn't there. I noticed Leanne had stopped mentioning anyone she was dating. She'd been casually seeing someone in the spring, a man named Kyle she'd mentioned twice and then never again. In summer, she said nothing. In early fall, when I asked, she said she'd been keeping a low profile, taking time for herself. She looked different when I saw her in August at our parents' anniversary dinner. Not dramatically, just a little fuller in the face, a little slower getting out of her chair. The kind of change you'd dismiss if you weren't the person you were. I didn't say anything. I filed it. I kept that drawer in my mind shut. By October, I had begun to suspect something that I told myself I couldn't actually suspect. Because suspecting it meant the shape of the thing in November had not been what everyone said it was. It meant Daniel had told me the truth, and there was a piece of the truth he didn't yet have himself. Daniel and I talked a lot that October. About our marriage. About what we were building and what we wanted it to hold. About the November thing and how we were choosing to carry it together, which we had decided we were. We had couples therapy on Thursday evenings with a woman named Dr. Patel who had a small cactus on her windowsill and a gift for sitting inside hard silences without filling them. We were in better shape than we looked from the outside. That's the part that's hard to explain. The November thing had been a rupture, but we had gone into the rupture together, and we had come out the other side knowing each other more honestly than we had before. Some marriages work that way when you let them. Daniel did not know what I suspected about Leanne. I hadn't told him because I wasn't certain, and a forensic accountant does not present a case before the evidence is complete. Thanksgiving was at my parents' house. It is always at my parents' house, a tradition of the immovable kind, the kind that has its own momentum. My mother starts the turkey the night before. My father's job is the cranberry sauce and looking proud. My uncle comes with wine again. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, brings her husband and the rolls they buy from the good bakery even though they always say they made them. There are usually 14 of us around the table. That year, there were 14 of us. Leanne arrived in a loose wrap dress that I had never seen before. She had a new haircut. She looked both anxious and luminous in the way that people look when they are carrying a decision they've already made. I watched her hug my mother. I watched her hug Daniel, briefly, the hug of two people who have agreed to perform normalcy and are almost convincing. I watched her look at me with something I could now identify precisely, which was the look of a woman who has decided that the only way to survive a secret is to turn it into an announcement. I said hello to my sister. She said hello to me. We did not hug. We had not hugged since November, and no one had said anything about that yet, but the whole family knew it the way families know things, the specific texture of an absence, the careful choreography of people working around a wound. Dinner was good the way Thanksgiving dinner is always good, abundant and slightly too loud and full of conversations being had in layers, the surface conversation and the one underneath it. My father told a story about the neighbor's dog that got away from him and ended up 3 streets over in someone else's yard. My Aunt Carol corrected my uncle gently on a fact about a movie they'd both seen. Daniel talked to my father-in-law about the bridge project. I watched my sister eat carefully, slowly, like someone monitoring herself. We were between the turkey and the pie when it happened. My mother had stood to get the dessert forks. Most of the table was settled into that comfortable post-meal slowness, full and warm, the candles burned lower. Daniel was to my left. Leanne was across from me and 2 seats down, between my Aunt Carol and a cousin named Ben who had not yet picked up on the atmospheric pressure in the room. Leanne set her wine glass down, not dramatically. Just put it on the table the way you put something down when you're done with it. And she placed her hands flat on the table, and she looked across at me with the expression of a woman who has rehearsed this so many times in the mirror that the performance has become its own conviction. She said, "There's something everyone should know," she said. "I'm pregnant." The table reorganized its attention. My mother stopped moving in the kitchen doorway. My father smiled automatically, the way he smiled at all announcements before he processed them. My Aunt Carol said, "Oh, how wonderful." And then Leanne, still looking at me, said, "Daniel is the father." The room did what rooms do. It went quiet in the total, airless way of 14 people all stopping at the same time. A fork somewhere made contact with a plate. A candle hissed. I did not move. I am a woman who has trained herself in the discipline of not moving before she understands exactly what she is looking at. I kept my hands flat on my thighs under the table. I felt Daniel go still beside me. My mother made a sound. My father said Leanne's name. My Aunt Carol said nothing, which was her version of a very strong reaction. Leanne's eyes were still on me, not triumphant. That was what surprised me. She looked afraid. The announcement wasn't jubilant. It was the action of a woman who had decided that blowing something up was better than watching it burn slowly, and who was now standing in the wreckage wondering if she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. My father said, "Daniel," and the name was a question. And Daniel, beside me, placed his hand over mine on the table. Gently, the deliberate placement of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and is now in it. He said, "Leanne, how far along are you?" She blinked. This wasn't the response she'd built for. She'd built for chaos, for me to stand up, for my father to raise his voice, for the table to become the arena she'd designed it to be. She said, "About 5 months." Daniel said, "And when do you believe the baby was conceived?" Her voice was less certain now. She said, "Around the end of June." Daniel said, still quiet, still with his hand over mine, "I was in Portland from June 8th through July 3rd for the Hawthorne Bridge project. I stayed at the Meridian Hotel. The firm has every receipt and every badge log. I was on site 6 days a week. I was with my project team for every dinner. I was not in the same state as you for the entire month of June." Leanne had stopped breathing visibly. Daniel said, "I know what happened in November. I told Nora what happened in November the same week, the whole of what happened. And what happened in November was that I stopped something before it started and walked away. There is nothing else between us. There has never been anything else. And the baby you're carrying is not mine." He said it without anger. That was the thing that I held on to in the minutes that followed when the table erupted, when my mother cried, when my father stood up and sat back down and stood up again, when my Aunt Carol took in the full geometry of the situation with the expression of a woman reorganizing a decade of observations. Daniel said it the way a man says a thing he has been certain of for a long time, in a room full of people who needed to hear it, calmly, with evidence attached. He said, "I've known about this since October, Nora. I wanted to tell you privately. I'm sorry it went this way." I looked at my husband. He was looking at me with the expression he had been wearing in October when we sat on the back porch in the cold, and he said, "There is something I need to tell you," and then told me all of it. What he'd seen, what he'd inferred, what he hadn't been certain of but had prepared for anyway. He had told me, not at the dinner table. In private, weeks ago, with the care of a man who builds load-bearing structures for a living and understands that foundations matter more than anything that goes on top. I had known since October and had not known what to do with it yet. I had been waiting, the way I always wait, for the complete picture. I looked at my sister. Leanne was not crying. She was sitting very still with her hands flat on her thighs, the same posture I'd taken, I noticed, which was its own kind of data point, and her face had the specific blankness of a person whose plan has collapsed around them and who hasn't yet figured out what expression comes next. My mother said, in the voice of a woman who is holding herself together by the thinnest possible thread, "Leanne, whose baby is it?" Leanne looked at the tablecloth. My mother said her name again. Leanne said, "Kyle." Kyle, the man she'd mentioned twice in the spring and then never again. The man she'd been seeing when she stopped returning my calls with any frequency. The man who, I now understood, had left or been left somewhere in the window between that November hallway and a positive pregnancy test that she had been looking at alone. My father sat down. My uncle, who had been silent through the entire thing, reached across the table for the wine and refilled his glass with the resignation of a man who had been to enough family dinners to know when the best contribution he could make was to stay out of the way. My Aunt Carol put her hand on my arm and didn't say anything. That was the right thing. She always knew the right thing and never wasted words on it. Daniel said, quietly, to the table, "I think Nora and I should give everyone some space." He stood. He pulled my chair back for me the way he had since our first date, a small, persistent habit that I had always loved with a ferocity I didn't often name. I stood. I looked at my sister, and the thing I felt in that moment was not what I had expected. It was not vindication, though there was a small, cold slice of something like it. It was not triumph. It was grief, the clean, acute kind, the kind that comes when something you loved reveals itself to have been partially a fiction. I said, "I hope you're all right, Leanne, and I hope Kyle knows." We walked out of my parents' dining room, past the kitchen where the pie still sat on the counter under a cloth, and out through the front door into the November cold. Fig was in the car. He had his nose pressed to the window. He wagged when he saw us, which was the most honest and correct response anyone had offered all evening. I stood on the sidewalk outside my parents' house with Daniel beside me, and the cold coming in off the street, and the light from inside the windows going yellow and warm. And inside that warm light, I could see my family beginning the process of digesting what had just happened, of rearranging themselves around a truth that was going to take a long time to fully understand. Daniel said, "I'm sorry it was at the table." I said, "You couldn't have known she was going to do it at the table." He said, "I should have told you everything in October and let you decide when and how. I made that choice for you and I'm sorry." I thought about that. I thought about October, about our back porch, about the conversation we'd actually had where he told me what he suspected and gave me the full picture and let me sit with it. He had told me. He had not made the choice for me. What he hadn't done was warn me that Thanksgiving might be the ignition point. I said, "You told me in October. We decided together to wait for the full picture." He said, "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. Still, I should have flagged Thanksgiving as a risk. I miscalculated. He is an engineer. Even in the worst moments, he performs a post-analysis. I had always loved this about him, even when it was also slightly maddening. I said, "Let's go home." We drove home. Fig fell asleep across the back seat. Daniel kept the radio off and his hand on the gear shift, not reaching for mine, just close to mine, available, the particular physical grammar of a man who respects the difference between comfort and intrusion. At home, I made tea. I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table, while Daniel made a fire in the living room that neither of us sat in front of. We moved around each other in the house with the careful precision of two people tending something fragile and valuable. I called my mother at 9 that night. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been sitting with her phone waiting. She said, "Leanne told us everything after you left." I said, "Is she all right?" My mother took a breath that was also most of a sentence. She said, "She's been alone with this since July." Kyle ended things when she told him. She's been trying to figure out how to. She stopped. She said, "She decided that if she announced it the way she did, you'd be so angry that the rest of it would be easier to explain. I think she thought your anger would. I don't know what she thought." I said, "She thought it would create enough noise that the real story would come out sideways rather than directly." My mother said, "Yes." I said, "She was afraid to tell me the truth, so she tried to make the truth someone else's fault." My mother didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Yes, I think that's it." I thought about my sister, alone since July with a pregnancy and a man who'd left, and a secret that had no good exit. I thought about how fear can move through a person and reshape every choice they make, until the choices stop looking like choices and start looking like desperation wearing a plan. I did not feel forgiving yet. I want to be honest about that. The forensic mind doesn't rush to conclusions that the evidence hasn't fully supported. And the evidence of Leanne's behavior that year, the retreating calls, the constructed distance, the calculation of the Thanksgiving announcement, added up to something I was going to need time to fully process. But I felt something that wasn't entirely anger, something that was starting to approximate grief, and then, very quietly, something further along than that, something that was the beginning of a longer work. I said to my mother, she needs prenatal care and she needs someone to drive her to appointments. She needs practical things. My mother said, yes. I said, I'll call her. Not tonight, but I'll call her. The calls from the wider family started the next morning. Cousins I spoke to twice a year suddenly very invested in checking in. My Aunt Carol, who called directly without preamble. I want you to know I believed Daniel the moment he spoke. I also want you to know I've known Leanne has been in trouble since August and I should have said something to you. I'm sorry I didn't. That call was the one I valued most. It was exact and honest and apologized for a specific thing, which is the only kind of apology that means anything. My uncle's only communication was a text that said, "Tough night. Good husband," followed by no further elaboration, which was approximately his emotional maximum and felt strangely sincere. My cousin Ben texted to say he'd had no idea what was happening, but in retrospect the table had felt like one of those nature documentaries where you can see something is about to happen to an animal, but can't do anything about it. Daniel went to work on Monday. He came home at 6:15. He made dinner, which was his habit. We ate at the table with Fig optimistic at our feet. We talked about work, about the bridge project, about the specific bureaucratic nightmare of a permit that had been pending for 3 months. We were ordinary. We were choosing to be ordinary with great deliberateness, and that deliberateness was its own form of devotion. I called Leanne on Sunday, 8 days after Thanksgiving. She answered on the first ring too, which meant she'd been waiting. I said, "Hi." She said, "Hi." Her voice was very small. I said, "I'm not calling to yell at you." She said, "I know." She paused. "I mean, you could. I would understand." I said, "I know I could. I'm calling to ask how you're doing, medically, practically, what you need." She was quiet for long enough that I could hear the specific quality of her trying not to cry. She said, "I have an OB. I have a 20-week anatomy scan next Friday." She paused. "I don't have anyone to take me." I said, "I'll take you." She said, "Nora." I said, "I'm not doing it because we're fine. We're not fine yet. I'm doing it because you're my sister and you're having a baby and you need someone in the room. And I am the person for that right now, whether or not the rest of it is resolved." She said, "Why?" I thought about it. I said, "Because you and I are going to have a long, hard, honest conversation at some point in the near future, and I need to know that before we get to that conversation you're being taken care of. You matter. Even when you've done something that hurt me badly, you still matter." She cried then, for real. Not the managed performing crying of the phone calls after November. The actual kind that comes from somewhere below the level where a person can control it. I didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't okay, but I stayed on the phone. The anatomy scan was on a Friday. The technician had warm hands and a calm voice and narrated everything she was seeing with the patience of someone who understood that the 2 women in the room were carrying more than a pregnancy between them. Leanne held my hand. I let her. On the screen, a whole small person, a spine like a string of careful beads, a heart with 4 chambers working exactly as intended. "A girl," the technician said. Leanne looked at the screen and then at me, and her face did something that had no performance in it. Pure and unguarded and afraid and grateful and full of love for something that was not yet in the world. I thought of what I would tell her later, what I was already planning to tell her. That what she had done at that Thanksgiving table was something I would need time to forgive. That the calls she'd stopped making in March and the distance she'd constructed all year had cost us something I was going to grieve. That manipulating a dinner table full of family into a detonation point for her secret was a choice that had real consequences for real people, and that I was not going to minimize those consequences out of love. But also that she was my sister. That the girl on the screen was going to be my niece. That family is not a thing you dissolve because the accounting is painful. You look at the books, you find the fraud, You deal with it clearly and honestly, and then you decide what the business is going to be going forward. We sat in the car in the parking garage after. Leanne had the scanned photos in her hands, the same kind of grainy gray square, a whole person in black and white. She turned them over and over. She said, "I panicked. I want you to know that's not an excuse. I panicked for 8 months, and every decision I made inside the panic was wrong, and I knew it was wrong while I was doing it, and I still couldn't stop." I said, "I know." She said, "When did you know? That the baby wasn't Daniel's?" I said, "October." She said, "He told you." I said, "He tells me everything. That's who he is." She absorbed that. She said, "He's a good man." I said, "He's a very good man. And you put him in a terrible position, and you put me in a terrible position, and you put yourself in the worst position of all." She said, "Yes." I said, "We're going to talk about all of it, but not today." She said, "Okay." I said, "Today you have a healthy baby girl with a working heart. Today you hold on to that." She pressed the scanned photo to her chest, the way I once saw a woman in a story press a photo to her chest in a hospital garden and call it still here, holding the evidence of something worth protecting. I started the car and drove her home. The honest conversation happened in December, at my kitchen table, with tea we actually drank. It was long and it was hard, and neither of us came out of it unchanged. I said things I had been carrying since November of the year before. She said things she had been carrying longer than that, about what it had been to be the one who needed attention and the costs she hadn't fully understood she was paying. We did not resolve everything. You can't resolve everything in one kitchen table conversation, and I have never trusted people who think you can. What we did was start the actual account, stop running from the numbers. Kyle called Leanne in January. He came to her first prenatal appointment in February. He is still working out, I think, who he wants to be in this situation. That is his work to do. I don't have a strong opinion yet. Daniel and Leanne have not had an extended conversation since Thanksgiving. He is not unkind to her. He is also not pretending that what happened at that dinner table was nothing. He is taking his time, and that is his right, and I respect it completely. My niece was born in April. 6 pounds, 11 ounces, black hair like Leanne's, a scream that filled the delivery room with the particular fury of someone outraged to have been disturbed. Leanne named her June, which I did not ask the reason for, but which I have privately decided is because June is the month she finally stopped being afraid. I was in the room when she was born. It was not the plan, or it was the plan we made over 4 months of difficult, honest work and a dozen kitchen table conversations, and 2 sessions with Dr. Patel, whose small cactus is still on the windowsill, and who has a gift for situations more complicated than she probably expected when she opened a couples therapy practice. I held June 20 minutes after she arrived. She was still furious about existing. She grabbed my finger with both hands and held on with the specific grip of someone who has decided that this is their person and they are not letting go. I thought about my grandfather's old saying that a family is just a room you choose to stay in. I had always thought that was about acceptance, about unconditional. I understand it differently now. Staying in the room is a choice. It costs something. You decide what the room is worth and you pay the cost with your eyes open, not because you have to, but because you've done the full accounting and the decision is still yes. My marriage is intact, more than intact. The rupture we went through, the November thing, the 8 months of careful navigation, the Thanksgiving detonation, all of it ran through the foundation and the foundation held. That is what load-bearing means. It doesn't mean untouched. It means it held. Daniel still makes dinner most nights. Fig still believes the couch is his. The kitchen on Carver Street still gets afternoon light on the back porch. The ordinary, unremarkable piece of a life that people tried to unsettle and couldn't. I want to tell you what I think was actually true about that Thanksgiving dinner, about the moment Leanne stood up and said the things she said. Because I've thought about it a great deal, and I think there are 2 ways to understand it. The first is that it was a calculated act, a woman who decided to use a room full of family as cover for a detonation that she hoped would generate enough confusion that the real truth could emerge sideways. And that is true. That is part of what it was. But the second thing is this. Leanne had been carrying an impossible weight for 8 months, alone, in a silence she'd built around herself because she was afraid. And the fear had been eating her from the inside until the only door she could see was the most dramatic one. That is also true. It doesn't excuse the damage, but it explains the shape of the thing. The calmer I stayed at that table, the faster the air left her balloon. She had built the announcement for a fight, for chaos, for the kinetic energy of a room in crisis. And what she got instead was my husband's quiet, factual voice and the sound of his timeline dismantling her narrative brick by brick without raising his voice once. You don't win with noise. You win with specifics. You win with the truth you've been carrying carefully, in order, with dates and receipt numbers and the particular patience of someone who has learned that the most powerful thing in any room is the person who isn't afraid of the silence. Daniel knew that. He had been sitting with his evidence since October, waiting for the moment to lay it down simply and completely, not to destroy anyone, but to tell the truth in a room where the truth needed to be heard. I knew that. I had been doing it for 11 years at a job where the truth lives in the gap between what people say and what the numbers show. June is 3 months old now. She has started to smile, the real kind, not the reflex kind. She smiles at Daniel when he holds her, which he does sometimes when we visit, carefully and with the gentleness of a man who has decided that an innocent baby is an innocent baby and that the complications of her arrival are above her pay grade for now. She smiles at Fig, who regards her with philosophical interest and has stopped trying to get the couch back when she's in the room, as if he has recognized a fellow creature of stubborn occupancy. She smiles at me like I am a specific person she has decided to know, which I am trying to deserve. Leanne and I talk on Tuesdays and Sundays again. The calls are different than they were, more careful, more honest, less effortless. I think this is what it looks like when two people stop performing closeness and start actually building it, which is harder and slower and the only kind that holds. People ask me sometimes how I stayed so calm at that dinner table. A room full of family, my sister making an announcement that was a bomb disguised as news, 14 people waiting for me to react. Here is the honest answer. I stayed calm because I had the full picture. I had done the accounting. I knew what the numbers actually said. And when you know what the numbers actually say, you don't have to be loud about it. You just have to be precise. You just have to be patient. You just have to trust that the truth, laid down clearly in front of people, speaks for itself. The scream was the trap. The stillness was the way out. It always is. That's my story. One dinner table, one announcement, and a husband who told the truth quietly in a room full of people who needed to hear it. If this reminded you that the calm ones aren't cold, they're just keeping receipts, share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.